we're going to start the final session of the day. And it is my honor to introduce Distinguished Fellow at ORF America, Bruce McConnell. Bruce was previously the president of the East-West Institute in New York and served as Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And we're really honored to have him with us today to moderate this final session.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's great to be here and see all of you. Thanks for coming out. As you know, this session is going to be rebroadcast tomorrow in Delhi, so we'll turn to some of the issues related to that aspect, that part of the world in a little while. But we have an excellent group here, and it's just going to be a conversation, so no boring opening statements from our panelists. But let me introduce them all to you first, and then we'll get underway. And I know these people, but I want to make sure I get their titles right. So at the other end is Christopher DeRusha, and he is the Federal Chief Information Security Officer at the Office of Management and Budget. And he has another hat, the Deputy National Cyber Director for Federal at the White House. Sitting next to him is Betsie Chacko, Associate Director for International Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, that's CISA, and that's at the Department of Homeland Security. And finally, Elina Noor, who is Director of Political Security Affairs and the Deputy Director of the Washington Office of the Asia Society Policy Institute here in Washington. So let's get into it. And I'm just going to ask them some questions, and after we've talked for a while, we'll give you the chance to ask questions also. So let's start with you, Chris. You have the kind of two hats you wear. How do you balance those, and what are your priorities? What does your day or week look like, and how does that work? Tell us what happens with you.
Yeah. What do my titles mean? So yeah, I have lots of hats. Bruce named a couple of them. I like to say that those two are really intended as one job in two offices. We just created this past year the Office of the National Cyber Director within the White House structure. And it's a new unit building itself out. And there's some common authorities shared in different places in the White House, including Office of Management and Budget, which I was appointed as the federal CISO. We thought it made a lot of sense to have one person managing kind of those portfolios as the new office grew out. And really what the job is setting strategy and policy direction, doing oversight and governance, performance management, ensuring resources aligned to all of that. Lots of those activities, and it's a lot because there's hundreds of federal agencies, and we're really focused on the federal civilian. To describe my daily responsibilities, there's lots that come with those, but I have a few other hats. I also chair the Federal CISO Council, and so that's the CISOs, the Chief Information Security Officers across the agencies. So we're having one coordinated information sharing way forward. I also chair what is called the Federal Acquisition Security Council. That's a group of all the federal agencies that have authorities in managing supply chain security, and we try to have one consolidated approach there. And then I sit on a couple of boards, the Technology Modernization Fund Board, which is a fund that's intended to inject capital into agency investments at a faster time frame than the annual budget process. And finally, I sit on the Cyber Safety Review Board, which is a new thing that we're doing to really inspect big incidents and events, try to learn lessons back as a public good. So those are, Bruce, the hats I wear and lots of activities. Happy to take questions on that later as well.
Well, what you're talking about, though, is a lot of coordination. So, right. That's the ideal situation is when the White House is and its various offices are trying to get the federal agencies to work together. But of course, that's challenging. It's always challenging for the center to coordinate the operating agencies. And we have Betsy here, who is from the premier cybersecurity operating agency on the civilian side. DHS, you all know the history of the formation of CISA, which used to be part of the Secretary's office and now is its own agency within DHS. So tell us about that. Tell us about your evolution, and also about how you get involved in an international direction of things.
Well, Bruce, first, thank you. A big thank you to ORF for the kind invitation. And as Bruce noted, I'm with the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency, and we were built off an HQ element. And I just want to take a moment and just honor Bruce and Chris and everyone who helped shape CISA to where it is. So we are the youngest federal agency in the US government. Our mission is to understand, manage, and reduce risks to cyber and critical infrastructure. The mission, it looks and sounds simple, but it is very complex. We are responsible for everything from electricity in your homes to water in your pipes to gas. And it's important for us it's very important for us to work with everyone. Partnerships is key and core to what we do. And I have the humble privilege of leading the international efforts at CISA. And I also have, hands down in my opinion, the best team, which is the CISA international team. So what a day looks like for me is a day in a week. What it looks like for me is that it revolves around 4 priorities. First, advancing operational cooperation with international partners. Second, building partner capacity. Third, engaging on stakeholder engagement and strengthening our relationships. And lastly, helping shape the ecosystems. So what does this look like in a day-to-day? So the first, on advancing operational collaboration with our international partners, it's really about understanding what our partners are seeing. Every country has a very unique set of eyes and ears. We want to learn and see what our partners are seeing. We very much do this through the computer emergency response teams. It's called CERTs, and every country has a CERT. In the US, we are the national CERT. And so we very much work with all CERTs around the world. For example, we work very closely with CERT India on day-to-day, sharing information, doing technical exchanges. Moving on to our second goal, which is capacity building. On any day-to-day, you will see myself and my team working with partners to figure out how do we build capacity for our countries. Right now, we're in the midst of planning for our 5th US-Japan ICS Cyber Week happening in October. So we will bring together partners to help put together an ICS, Industrial Control Systems, capacity building training. And the third and fourth goal is how do we exchange and share information more? How do we learn from each other? So definitely on the engagement stakeholder, we do expert-to-expert exchanges. We're working with our partners in Asia, sharing how do they do elections? How do they understand national critical functions? How are they thinking of cybersecurity? And then the last goal is engaging on policy discussions, just like I'm doing here today. How can we have conversations on policy, and how do we advance cybersecurity in the arenas?
Great, thank you so much. So we've now heard a couple of US perspectives here, and to kind of keep things balanced, we are honored to have Elina Noor, who I worked with on the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. She was a commissioner there. And we came up with a lot of recommendations for how states should behave in cyberspace for responsible behavior in cyberspace. So Elina, since then, has now moved to the Asia Society. Tell us what you're working on.
Yeah, so I guess I'm the sore thumb on this panel. I'm not with government. I don't have all these illustrious capacities that I'm juggling at the same time. But I am working, thank you Bruce for asking, I'm working on this project related to Southeast Asia and technology. So I'm from Southeast Asia, I'm from Malaysia, and everybody in this town knows there's a lot of focus on all things US, all things China, and often the countries in the middle kind of get forgotten or overlooked. And so I see myself as trying to amplify some of these forgotten voices. So with this particular project, I'm working on AI ethics and data protection and how they're being approached by 5 different countries in Southeast Asia. So crunch time right now, trying to write up the report. So stay tuned.
That's great. So we're going to lapse now move more into the international dimension of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is an international activity. It's an international problem, and it doesn't respect boundaries. And so, Chris, you've been in the federal government, but before this current assignment, you were in state government, so you've seen the world at that level. Now you're at the national government, and tell us about your perspective on international cyber, and how does that fit into U.S. priorities?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Betsy covered a lot of it. It's a very helpful rundown of kind of the priorities and the way that you think about all of the engagements. So I completely agree with that framework. Where it's really helpful in my current role, sitting managing all of these hundreds of federal agencies and ensuring that we have a common baseline and we're doing things the right way. When you stop and think about it, you want to benchmark your progress. And that's one of the ways you know if you're doing well. It's kind of hard to benchmark when you got a job like this unless you look to another country. And I think one of the things that is really helpful is having engagements with people who hold a similar job in other countries. It's something that I try to be intentional about doing. And I just find that we all have different cultures. We're all organized very differently to solve these problems. There's different authorities given to different types of agencies. Some run the operation more from kind of an intelligence lens and some from public-facing civilian lens like we do. You all are familiar with this dynamic, but what you'll find is when you have something like a Log4j, a solar winds event, or even right now with higher geopolitical tensions and sort of an uncertain path and what could happen, you tend to think about and react to that in similar ways and different ways. And so I think it's really helpful to validate some of the approaches, learn from what others are doing, and then try to emulate that where it makes sense. And for those reasons, we're very, very active right now, and not just engaging critical infrastructure and all of this, which CISA is doing a fantastic job of briefing critical infrastructure partners on the risks, but really also engaging our international partners.
So, that brings up for me a question about people look at things the same way, but they also look at them differently. You've been talking, Betsy, about, and to, a lot of international partners at the level of certs, and where people may have different views of what is critical infrastructure. Is that mostly a matter of terminology, or are there really differences in priorities? And does that break down depending on if it's a highly industrialized country versus a more rural country? Can you give us some perspective on that?
Yeah, definitely. I want to echo Chris's comment. I think what he noted here was very important. Countries are facing the same issues we are facing here in the U.S., right? So it goes to if you're seeing the same issues and we also have the same issues, so it's important for us to be collective and help mitigate those risks together. And to your question, Bruce, like critical infrastructure, that's one of the questions on capacity building we get a lot. Because it's not that we see a difference in terminology, it's because everyone wants to understand how we identify critical infrastructure, and also it's important for us to hear how they identify. And we're also hearing from a lot of partners of how do you identify critical infrastructure? So there's a range of spectrum there when it comes to sharing our methodology, sharing our understanding, and how we approach these issues. And just to address why is international engagement important, that is my day-to-day job. But we are a domestic cyber, we are a domestic agency, we are a domestic cyber agency, but we understand what happens overseas impacts our homeland and vice versa. We saw that with the motor vessel Evergreen in Suez Canal, right? This is not just on the cyber, and it's both on cyber and physical, right? What happens there impacts our supply chains. Right now we're seeing this with Ukraine, right? We understand very importantly that what happens overseas impacts the homeland and vice versa. So we have to share the information across. We also understand that there's a network of like-minded partners, and it's important for us to come together and help put the collective defense together. And then lastly, we also know that countries are trying to navigate the sphere, that they understand that, hey, we want to make sure we're able to give options that are secure and economically viable. So right now we have this opportunity in a window for us to work together. And as I noted earlier, that's the reason why every single day we're working towards advancing operational cooperation with partners, building partner capacity, shaping the ecosystem, and continuing to exchange our approaches.
So we're hearing again, that interacting with international partners is important to the U.S. What's your perspective on this? Is the U.S. a preferred partner for some of these things, or are there other places that you think people are equally interested in hearing from, particularly with a Southeast Asian perspective? What's the kind of look like from there?
So I think the U.S. is definitely one of the preferred partners in the region, and there's a lot of work and cooperation taking place with different countries in the region. But I think, Betsy, you made a really good point about this definition of critical infrastructure, because there's a lot of uncertainty still, particularly in the less developed economies in Southeast Asia, about how to even define critical infrastructure. And countries are looking to other countries in the region, but also abroad, to try to figure that out. Things like language matters, right? In Malaysia, so we translate cybersecurity as keselamatan cyber, but keselamatan also has a connotation of safety. So the ambit of cybersecurity suddenly gets very broad in countries that don't have the exact same translations or interpretations of a word that we, who speak English quite comfortably, are familiar with. And so these notions, I think, permeate through capacity building initiatives, because when negotiating on capacity building with partners, there's the issue of language, there's also the issue of resources, and there's the issue of just the ability to absorb all the assistance and support that's being offered. And so I'm sure you know this very well, Betsy. But I think in Southeast Asia, countries are looking not only to the US, but also to countries the US would consider adversaries for help and support, because these countries plug gaps in different ways that no one particular provider can.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting about that cyber safety is part of cybersecurity. The other thing that's becoming part of cybersecurity is disinformation. And a lot of, I think, cyber people find themselves pulled into conversations about how do you deal with disinformation and the impact of social media platforms. And certainly overseas, where the social media platforms are run by U.S. companies in many ways, there's a whole political dynamic around that. So we might come back to that point. But I wanted to ask the panelists about, Betsy, you mentioned this, and Chris also, indirectly, increased geopolitical tension. So how has Ukraine's situation affected what your priorities are and just the rhythm of your work? You want to start?
Yeah. Well, it definitely has. And I think the first point here, Bruce, is this is kind of a new norm, a new reality. Anytime you've got a geopolitical conflict that results for your nation in a threat of capability and intent, in this case, potential intent, but high potential, right? That is the U.S. assessment. And, it changes the dynamic, because there is actual belief that these actors have the ability to affect critical infrastructure here in the United States. And that is why we've had, led by CISA, what we call a shields up effort to really make sure that there's information is being shared and everybody's kind of at a high state of readiness for some potentiality. And, I think that's fairly new. It's hard for some folks to really kind of digest too. It's sort of a new concept that could have that much reaching effect, but in a level of conflict that is far below some other places it could go. And so it just makes it a lot more realistic that it could be sort of the next phase of an event like we're facing right now. So that is new, and we take it very seriously. Well, there isn't necessarily direct information for a high level of threat on federal government assets. We own, run, and operate critical infrastructure, right? We have a lot of sensitive data, control systems. When you think about what the federal government does, right, and what these 100 agencies
like the air traffic control system, right?
Air traffic control system, satellites.
The Federal Reserve, right.
Control systems in space. I mean, there's a long list of things that IRS, a lot of attractive targets for our government, right? So, we have to take it seriously. We do. We've kind of been doing all the same measures that we've been asking our critical infrastructure partners to take. We're taking ourselves. So, yeah, it has been a pretty big insertion into our daily activities, Bruce, and just continues to be. Like, there's no change in posture.
Yeah, well, Betsy, we were talking about this a little bit before the panel started about, you're out there kind of ringing the alarm, if you will, and getting people to put the shields up, as Chris said. So how's that going in terms of a couple of aspects of it? Maybe one is, big companies have more capacity to deal with this. So how are you thinking about smaller companies and nonprofits, universities, et cetera? And then another kind of angle on this is, how about fatigue? Are people able to, we're all tired, disgusted with masks, right? We have mask fatigue. So this is another kind of shields up, right? How's that going?
Yeah, no, just to echo everything that Chris is saying, our director has definitely said, and given us guidance, preparation, not panic. And that's why it's important to have our shields up, and we, since late 2021, we've been out there doing briefings to our critical infrastructure partners, classified and unclassified, making sure that they're getting the information. We established this Shields Up webpage to provide all the alerts, all the advisories we know. We're offering up services to the small, medium businesses, to every single organization, so they can take a heightened sense of cybersecurity and be able to also implement those measures. Definitely to your point, fatigue, we hear it, but we are continuing to beat that drum, continue to keep your shields up. And the things that we're asking are also basic cyber hygiene measures. So overall, we're just asking everyone to shields up, help us increase the cybersecurity, continue to increase and strengthen the cybersecurity posture.
Yeah, so these are things they should have been doing anyway, and as they say, never waste a good crisis, right? So that's what you're doing now. Yeah. What's sort of moving a little bit outside the realm of cybersecurity, but Elina, you and I have talked many times about how smaller countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, sometimes find themselves caught between the U.S. and China, not wanting to pick sides. So how's the Russia angle here playing? What's your sense of that, in cyber or otherwise?
Yeah, I think the first thing to remember is that Southeast Asia is still emerging from the throes of COVID-19, right? So there's a lot of preoccupation on trying to revive the economy, just trying to get things running again. It's not quite business as usual yet, in the way that we used to here in the United States. So that's the big overarching context. And then throw in Russia, Ukraine. A lot of Southeast Asian countries don't have the same kinds of antagonistic relationships with Russia that the US does. And so there isn't this sense that shields need to be up, though there is this awareness that, of course, there are systems, platforms, and infrastructure that are always vulnerable to attacks or compromises. And I think finally, it's just a matter of capacity again and resources. Because of this emergence, very slow emergence out of the pandemic, other priorities taking precedence, there's a sense that in many countries that what's going on in Russia, let alone in the virtual space with regards to Ukraine and Russia, are a little distant. There is the risk of disinformation, which I think countries like Indonesia and Singapore are trying to grapple with. There are many anecdotes about Russian disinformation that are being spread on social media, and the sentiment on the ground does not always accord with the government position sometimes. So that's something domestic governments also have to contend with in Southeast Asia.
So as I mentioned earlier, this session will be rebroadcast tomorrow in Delhi. So we expect there at the Raisina conference, which is a very high-level ministerial and sometimes head of state level conference, that there will be quite a few people there from South Asia. So what advice would you have panelists about how people from that part of the world can cooperate better on cybersecurity? You want to start?
Yeah, well, look, we've had good cooperation for a while, but I really think it's time to get into this next phase of really making it about tangible things. Let me give you an example. We issued an executive order, 14028, call it the Cyber Executive Order last year. And it issued a whole lot of action, all going after specific root causes that we've been building over the years. And we kind of took them all on, and it's been a busy year as a result. But some of those have led to deliverables that we think are useful products and goods that can be used by folks anywhere in the country, in different countries. There's principles and things in there, and that's because we crowdsourced them. Our zero trust strategy, we got hundreds of inputs from different companies, experts, people from labs, academics. I mean, we crowdsourced brainpower of expertise in zero trust, and we build a document collaboratively and then publish that publicly, it's a decent roadmap. It's a starting point. If you're looking for that, it's a place you can look. We did some other things like that where even just kind of when you're doing an investigation, you need to understand how do you think about prioritizing your log retention, because it's really expensive to store everything. But so where do you start and how do you think about that? Collaboration with CISA, we put out a document that says here's a maturity model for the first time on how to do that, how to think about that. And people can take these anywhere and grab them and build off of them, make them better, keep going. I think that's where we've got to get. I mean, we know what the problem is. Sharing sort of cybersecurity is real problem stories is like really not interesting anymore. It's 2022. Solve it, share how you solved it, and then see if there's applicable lessons, and then just keep building that. And that's where we're trying to go. We're trying to be leaders on that. But I think everybody can be a leader on that.
No, I couldn't agree with you more on your last point. When I was working with you guys at DHS 10 years ago, it was like I would gauge the maturity of the conversation based on how much time was spent admiring the problem and how much time was spent solving the problem. So we've definitely made progress in that area. Betsy, you mentioned earlier that you have great relations with CERT India. And so what other advice do you have for India and its neighbors in this realm as we go into the next few years?
Awesome. Well, first I want to say thank you because in the most unprecedented times, in the most isolating times, we were able to harness technology and still continue our partnerships with our countries in Asia. And we've done more than we ever could have. I have been in so many Zoom and webinars from 6 a.m. to at 10 p.m. at night, and it's just been an absolute honor and a delight to partner with our colleagues in Asia. Second, absolutely to Chris's point, when you have solutions, please share it, and we will also do it. Vice versa, we look forward because once again, the same problems we have here are the same problems that you are seeing, and the same solutions that work there work for us too. So continue, and then lastly, please join us as we continue our effort on Shields Up.
So global Shields Up, huh?
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, good. And your advice?
Well, I don't know about advice. It's more a request, really. We've been talking a lot about hard security, right? So it's in critical infrastructure and all that. I think there's a lot of space for policy consideration in terms of global norms that we worked on in the Commission. For a lot of countries that find themselves squeezed between these intensifying tensions between the United States and China, I think there's potential to cooperate, to coordinate, and to potentially align positions in a way that will provide more wiggle room, more policy space, and maneuverability for a lot of these countries to find different ways to forge their futures ahead in cyberspace. A lot of developing countries are just trying to keep up with this rat race, this technological rat race, and don't really have the opportunity to just sit back and understand what it is that their country or community needs based on their historical and developmental context. A lot of models are being viewed, sometimes copied and pasted, unfortunately. But I think if we can kind of work together with giants like India to try to preserve that space in order for us to shape our own futures, separate from what's already been created, I think that would be super and could potentially unlock a more interesting future.
So can I drill down on that point a little bit, I think, because it sounds like you're sort of discussing a kind of a G77 for cyber or something like that, or non-aligned, or is that where you're going with this?
Yeah, I mean, there have been, I've seen papers written, Latha Reddy co-wrote a paper on whether there's a non-aligned movement that might be available in cyberspace. And I think it's definitely a potential worth exploring. I know these terms, G77, NAM, and all these are all passé in a way, but I think we have to step back and question why these terms have become passé and whether we can rejuvenate them in different ways for the technological age.
So if we could, I'd like to dig down a little bit, and then pretty soon I'm maybe somebody will tell me when we have about 20 minutes left, and I'll turn it over to you for questions. But Chris, you mentioned that the executive order laid out a whole bunch of root causes, right? So what were what if you mentioned log storage and some other things. So what are the ones that are proving the most difficult to tackle?
Oh, that's a really good question. There's a few for different reasons. One just takes time, like contracts, okay? If something isn't in a contract clause, particularly in a system like we have in the US, there's a full collaboration with vendor partners. And if you haven't put it into a contract that you expect certain things, it hasn't been priced into the contract, and also it's hard to enforce, right? And so what we've tried to do is take an assessment of all of the best contract clauses and the gap areas, and we worked hard on all of that, and we sent it to our Federal Acquisition Rules Council, and then now they need to do public comment period and go through a process, right, to sort of get those concurred to and out to the public, and then to a state where we can build them in. It just takes time.
Yeah.
Right?
So just let me ask a little bit more. That's a great example, because in security, of course, it's always hard to measure success, right? Because it's the absence of something bad that happens. And so did you invest enough? Nothing bad happened, so did you invest too much, right? So on these contract clauses, what kinds of things, how do you measure a contractor who's providing a service or a facility or a system? What are some of the tricks you've learned having reviewed many attempts at trying to do this, right? Presumably it's not just like how many pages of cyber reports they prepared.
No, I mean, there's things that are kind of real barriers. At times, even with a vendor partner who wants to share information with government, sometimes there may be either a lack of a provision or a provision preventing, right? And so kind of working through that in a way that works for everybody is one key piece of it. Also other things that we're trying to work through that are a big challenge is secure software development, and we have another big initiative around that, which is ensuring that if federal government's going to procure software, that is those vendors are following secure development practices. But it's going to be a road, you know what I mean, and we've already stated that is our expectation as federal government. And then now we're going to be putting out official guidance and kind of how to move through that and build into the contracts, right? Because all that's going to happen, things like software bill of materials, a concept of an ingredients list for a piece of software so that you can actually understand when you have a Log4j type vulnerability event, where in the software and is it present? I mean, things that people struggle with again and again. But again, these are hard root cause issues, maybe weren't fully thought through when we built this ecosystem, and now we're going backwards, trying to piece through, all of that and kind of rebuild the system in a way now that the risks are so much higher. Some of these things that don't necessarily present themselves as shiny things to work on are the things, right? Because I say root cause because it's just again and again and again. It's these same things that just need to be settled and worked through.
Yeah, it's a long slog.
Right.
So how does this root cause analysis and correction, how does that fit in with the shields up, prepare, don't panic? How do those two things work together,
I think a lot of, the things we're seeing and the alerts and advisories we're publishing on Shields Up, right? So we are trying to provide mitigation to, hey, this is the way you can help secure your systems, your networks. These are services that we can provide. These are just basic minimum measures that you can take to help, mitigate these causes and help reduce the risk overall.
Yeah. Yeah, so, the thing I was thinking about, we were talking about a little bit earlier, is capacity, right? So it's partly just the capacity priorities, like you were saying, Elina. Some people there are other problems that people are working on, and there's also global shortage of skilled cyber professionals, and so smaller countries and smaller companies have more difficulty putting their shields up and keeping them up. Not only in the technical area, but in the policy area. I guess my question, and this is sort of something I wonder about, right? to what extent does the migration to the cloud, where cloud service providers are providing a lot of the security, if you're using the G Drive or something like that, or Amazon Web Services, or Azure, Microsoft Azure, those services provide a lot of security. So has that, in general, making a difference for the level of security that companies and other organizations have? Government and agencies even are using these. Is there a wholesale benefit in some ways to using the cloud?
Yeah, I'll happy to take this one first. Yes, is our estimation. And so, you have to provision your cloud securely, and a lot of that's about good configuration management and also just understanding your responsibilities, what controls you are responsible for and what the cloud provider does. I think in our early movements there's a lot of assumptions around, they're doing X now. And it's like, well, they're managing a lot of the risk. It's very helpful for vulnerability management and like keeping systems up to date. And I think that's the thing, Bruce, is, we need to specialize in sort of discrete security capabilities now, in security operations center capabilities and detection and getting really kind of targeted in that. And I think the more that you can hand off to a trusted partner that's going to be able to do that stuff faster, more efficiently, and have all the expertise in-house on their infrastructure, as opposed to trying to replicate that everywhere, it doesn't make sense, And I think that is the reason you see that while we acknowledge fully that there are new risks to moving to the cloud, the benefits just outweigh it.
Well, Betsy, you mentioned that you run the national CERT at CISA. So at least in the old days, there was a lot of critical infrastructure partners who were on the floor, on the operations floor, with their being able to be kind of hand in hand with the feds. To protect their own infrastructures, particularly in some of the most critical infrastructures. How's that going, and how do the cloud service providers fit into that architecture?
Yeah. Yes. So back in the day, those were the watch tours. Yes. So the U.S. CERT sits within CISA. But Bruce, to your point, the public-private partnership model, it's definitely, that's one of the things I would just note that we are working to transform, right? Back in the day, it used to be one meeting here and one meeting there. But one of the things we've done over this past year is we established the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. And the whole goal of that is to make our collaboration with the private sector real time, So it's not just one meeting to another, but it's sharing information right then in real time. And that's definitely getting to Chris's point. How do you reduce the risk? When you see a risk, how do we mitigate it together? And that is the type of approach that we are definitely trying to transform.
So it is true then that there is a move from information sharing to operational collaboration.
Yes.
It seems to me that's really exciting. Well, speaking of these cloud service providers, Elina, who are generally U.S. companies, right? So I mentioned earlier the issues around U.S. platforms in the information space and social media space, but you also have dependencies on U.S. companies for basic infrastructure services. So how does that play out? What issues do you hear about and perhaps think about in that context for smaller countries? Is there a feeling of excessive dependency or resentment or anything like that?
So there's a lot of exuberance in Southeast Asia about all things tech, right?
Yeah.
And the more acronyms you throw related to tech, AI, IoT, 4IR, the more excited people get. But I feel there's not enough deep consideration about the implications, the longer-term implications of these new technologies that are being embraced so readily by so many countries in Southeast Asia. For example, with artificial intelligence, a lot of the models and technologies are being imported and provided for by countries outside of these Southeast Asian nations. There isn't enough discussion in the public space, I would be willing to bet not even in the policy space, about how the algorithms are being trained or what data sets are being used, how data is being collected, how private and secure is this data, are these data sets being fed to companies abroad, and how are these companies monetizing or using these data sets? do the costs and benefits outweigh each other in different instances for these particular countries that are so reliant and dependent on outside technology. There are countries like Vietnam that are trying to set up their own indigenous capabilities and capacities. They have really, if you look into some of the examples that they have, really fascinating developments and innovations that are kind of modeled on Western technologies, but are repurposed and refitted for local context to suit the needs and demands of the local culture, languages, etc., etc.
Right, you were telling me earlier about this, the Vietnamese version of Siri or Alexa.
That's right. It's called Kiki.
Kiki?
And it's a local innovation because Kiki understands the different regional dialects in Vietnam. There are 3 main regional dialects in a way that Amazon, Alexa, or Apple Siri or Google Assistant can't. And you know, for someone who, like me, who doesn't have an American accent or any other Western accent, it's incredibly frustrating to call out to Alexa or Siri and then to ask for something and not be understood at all. And so Kiki was meant to fill this gap in the Vietnamese marketplace.
Wow, that's exciting. That's really exciting. Well, let me turn it over to you. I can come up with questions, and for our panelists. But what is on your mind? What interesting thoughts have you had that you might want to? Okay, Dhruva. I might want to stimulate us with here. Exactly.
Thank you. I guess I have a question for Chris and Betsy. I focus more on the domestic side. You mentioned in some ways working with the private sector, which is one partner. What are frustrations or concerns that you have about public knowledge, public understanding about cybersecurity issues? Are there gaps in the general public's awareness about what some of the challenges are and what they can be doing themselves to ensure sort of greater security of their own personal information and so forth? Is that something that your agencies are focused on, and how are they going about trying to address that?
I'll start and then, awesome. Well, my favorite month of the year is October because it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So this is one of our big campaigns here that we focus on because, to your point, we are very much, how do you get that information out to the public? How do you build that cybersecurity awareness from at all ages, at all levels? We are very much focused on that, figuring out how do we engage the public on this. So definitely during the month of October, not just here in the US, but one of my favorite things is also just seeing around the world how October is celebrated. And to your point, it's so interesting to see how every country comes up with their own campaign and the language they use and the commercials. But it's a fantastic collaboration across the globe.
Yeah, I think I'll draw on a couple prior experiences I've had that less kind of focus on my current job. The two would be as being chief security officer for a state, right? And I had some responsibilities facing out. One of the things we're trying to do is just like make it real to people. How do you do that? So we came up with some, innovative programs where we purchased Michigan Secure, is what we labeled it, and it was really just like a application that you download on your phone that secures your phone, alerts you to bad Wi-Fi connections, like lack of encrypted networks, downloading a malicious application on an Android phone, for example, like less so on Apple's, like stuff like that. I mean, it's like, yes, you're like protecting the phone, but also you're just saying, oh, my phone's not secure? What do you mean? Like, it's not been telling me that. Well, yeah, that's part of the problem. It's not been telling you that. It's like a aha moment. That's a big issue. Move on from that campaign. I was the chief information security officer on the Biden campaign. Well, one of the things you're trying to do there is just like lock down everybody because you don't have the federal resources, but you got interested people globally. And your biggest gaps aren't the network that you own, run, and operate and can secure. It's like all the people's personal stuff. That was the attack surface. And we had this whole program where when people come in, we'd go through spend hours with each individual and just run through locking down their personal life accounts. We had a list of like 40 things that they could do. And we had people dedicated to spending time with them and like turning on multi-factor in all of their personal accounts. And just, I mean, you would be shocked at like how little coverage there's in those things. And also like helping them through privacy settings. We had people who were targeted in the campaign for their involvement in certain times and they got attacked. We helped them with like privacy settings and all the things that they can do to like kind of ensure that their personal information is like not everywhere. And it's stuff like that I just think, I think it's a real challenge. More and more, online harassment is becoming a real big deal everywhere. It's just going to continue to be an issue. And I think people need to understand that, like, listen, like, yes, the federal government's working for you. Yes, the responsibility of government's here. It's also a personal accountable responsibility, like driving a car and make sure your brakes work and you're wearing a seatbelt. I mean, we all acknowledge those are personal responsibilities. And I just think that like we haven't gotten to that sweet spot of like acknowledging what are our personal responsibilities and what are corporate or what are government. It's still like a bit of a poorly understood state of affairs, and I think that continues to be a challenge.
Well, there's two big targets that your answer gave. One is, of course, what's going to happen with the Musk's acquisition of Twitter. So we've probably not tried to analyze that here, but we're all sitting going, what's now going to happen with online harassment and things like that. But the other thing that came to me on that was just when you were saying that the ability to have these privacy settings and whatnot, it's like very labor intensive. You had a very labor intensive activity, right. And you say, well, okay, it's your personal responsibility to wear seatbelts and have good brakes. It's actually also the law. It's required right at the national level or at the state level, and we're obviously not there yet because of the view that's prevailed so far anyway, which is in general that regulation will hurt innovation. And at some point, right, we all think, you may not want to say this publicly as government officials, but I think that we're going to come to that place where it'll be like any other technology and there will be mandated controls on, so that, for example, software ships with the security turned on, and that's a requirement. So we're getting there through the market, but it sometimes isn't good enough. Who else has a question? All right, in the back, and then you.
Betsy, I wanted to get the sense from you about the collaboration with India. Could you give us a flavor of what these conversations and what this partnership entails? Is it information sharing? Many things in your field, the successes are invisible, right? So what's the... And based on that information sharing, what are the nature of threats that you have identified that are common to both, but that India also faces? And I had a subsequent question for Eileen. You spoke about how Southeast Asia is willing to work with US, but also willing to work with US as adversaries, and G77 and the NAM model. How do you think about the politics of cyber threats? And in terms of the threats posed by states, how do you see Southeast Asian countries navigating that? Which countries do they identify as potential threats to their own cybersecurity?
So what I want to do is ask you to ask your question too, and then we'll answer them all. Those are great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was a good idea because my question kind of is related. So I'm Hassan. I'm from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology. Thank you for that insightful discussion. So one question that I wanted to ask was about challenges to operational collaboration. And I guess, Betsy, perhaps this is something that you touched upon. So when I say that, this is not only operational collaboration amongst allies and partner countries, but also like within the US. So one of the challenges that we often come across is, of course, interoperability and sharing of sensitive information and data. So how do you kind of mitigate that in your day-to-day work, and like any best practices?
Great. Okay. You got two questions, so fire away, starting with India.
Great, yeah. So our collaboration is cert to cert, so we are sharing information. Our advisories, we share with them and they share with us. We've also working with the Critical Infrastructure Agency there. We've been doing expert-to-expert exchanges. Our efforts just it's very much on mutual topics of interest, right? During COVID, we were doing a lot of conversations of what they were seeing with their companies, our companies, how are we handling supply chain. So those are the topics of mutual interest are the topics we share. And then to address your question on challenges, especially on the information sharing, one of the challenges we see is that a lot of countries sometimes are hesitant to share with us because their alerts are in the language of the country. So it's hard to share, especially if we can't get it translated. That's one of the concerns and challenges that we are navigating through, and now we're working through that.
Just to amplify on the gentleman's first question about the collaboration, have there been any examples that you can talk about where you've really worked with the CERT India to solve a specific campaign or deal with a specific campaign?
It's not more of campaigns, it's more of like a mutual issue, like sharing our best practices, or if we're going through an issue together like COVID, it's understanding what they're seeing and what we're seeing, and identifying our mitigations.
Right, and in terms of supply chain, you mentioned specifically. Okay, great, thank you. Elina, you want to talk about cyber geopolitics?
Yeah, that easy question.
Yeah.
So anybody familiar with Southeast Asia or ASEAN will know that the three monkeys, I'm not in government, so I can be a bit more blunt. So, you close your eyes, close your ears, and close your mouth. That's kind of how a lot of Southeast Asian governments have been treating some of the cyber threats. There are open source studies and reports out there about the threats emanating virtually in the cyber domain from the South China Sea dispute. And these threats have already been out there and deliberated upon in a technical manner for years, about 10 years at the very least. There is awareness of it, but there's not much public discussion of it. And part of that is deliberate because there's an aversion to discussing political and security conflicts within Southeast Asia, much more when it involves a major power sitting right in your backyard. But there are also threats that are emanating from immediate neighbors. And this is also known, but it's not discussed. Again, and this kind of underpins almost in a way the rationale of ASEAN, right? You acknowledge that there are these historical and current tensions going on even in the cyber domain. You try to work it out in very circuitous ways in different formats and in multilateral settings. So it's basically kicking the can down the road and hoping that things will resolve on their own through a lot of dialogue and discussion and negotiation if it comes down to that.
Yeah, well, and of course, I'm sure that there are examples of countries where they are, because of lax controls or lack of capacity, they become hosts for, they become sort of way stations for third country attacks, and then, those kind of conversations about why are your servers attacking us? Well, it was those other guys.
Right.
So yeah, difficult conversations.
And you almost never hear a Southeast Asian country join in attributing an operation or an attack to any particular country.
Correct, yeah. Any other questions from you guys out there? All right. So let me again. I'm always trying to go from the general to the specific, right? So if looking ahead, what do you guys all think? Give us your views on where this is going. I mean, let's think we're having this conversation 5 years from now. Many times you can say there's nothing. We're having the same conversation. In some ways, we've been having a different conversation. It's been much more about operational collaboration rather than just information sharing, and the level of kind of technical sophistication is better. But so in your either crystal ball or your desired world, what does it look like 5 years from now? Chris, you want to start?
Yeah, well, don't have a crystal ball, but there's different potential futures. I think the one that we're most concerned about is one that kind of stays on the path that we've seen in the last year and then sort of like continues in that direction. Like, what do I mean by that? You look at events like the Colonial Pipeline event, right? That wasn't even necessarily the criminal actors' stated intent to have the full pipeline network shut down. That was a corporate decision to manage the risk based on the information they had at the time, okay? And it led to a massive disruption where it turned into like a real sort of physical disruption event of like resources that we all rely on. And it was in part just kind of a business decision and a miscalculation by a threat actor that led to that. Not even a direct like trying to do it. Well, when we get more into the direct trying to do it, this whole thing changes. And the cover your mouth, cover your ears, cover your eyes problem, when you're dealing with ransomware and destructive malware, doesn't work. And unfortunately, the folks who've been taking that approach, it's going to be real sharp. Like they're not going to have enough time to react if it goes in that direction 5 years from now. And the only responsible path we see is shine a bright light on all of these bad problems, and it's not going to be fun, and it's going to be hard, and people are going to feel very uncomfortable. But the alternative to us is not acceptable.
All right.
So there's the drastic. Somebody should take the friendlier future.
Okay, on this point, are you jumping in on this? I'm not. Okay, well, let me get those little vignettes, and you'll get the last question, okay?
I'll take a friendlier. So over the years, we've seen our partnerships going from information sharing to now we're in operational collaboration. And so if not that I have a crystal ball here, but if we could evolve our partnerships over to joint action, right? As we are shining that light on problems, if we can collectively come together and take joint action, I think that will help reduce the risk globally.
Yeah, well, and we've seen that on some cases where there's been joint public-private action to shut down bad botnets and things like that. So we're getting there. Yeah. Okay.
Also, no crystal ball, but apparently we do have a metaverse. So if I were to peer into the metaverse, I actually would hope for a greater sense of awareness and agency by countries that are not behemoths in the tech space to try to carve their own futures. A lot of what we have now is operating within the current frameworks and parameters. And this is, again, a little bit philosophical rather than specific. But I hope that based on our traditions, histories, and cultures, we can begin to explore a different type of future or futures for countries caught in the middle of great power competition in the tech space.
Okay. All righty. 2 minutes, and the last question.
I'll retract.
You'll pass? Tracked. Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much. I think this has been quite a broad-ranging discussion. We've covered a lot of territory, and we're reminded that in the current geopolitical situation, the stakes are only increasing, and so shields up is the watchword. Prepare, don't panic. And with that, please join me in thanking our panelists for a great conversation.
Thanks, Bruce. Sorry for you, just have the mic on. Thank you. Thanks, Bruce. It leaves it to me to just say a few words of thanks. It'll just be a couple of minutes because it's been a long day. First, I want to thank all the speakers and moderators today. We had 3 excellent sessions. I learned lots from all 3. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules. We had several people from the U.S. government present, and we really appreciate their taking the time to come and talk about various things, including cybersecurity, with us today. So first, join me in one round of applause to all the speakers. Secondly, I do want to give a very quick but very a real thanks to my colleagues who made this possible. I hope all of you have had the occasion to meet with them. As I said, we're a new organization, so do acquaint yourself with, a lot of them are here present and sending. Just briefly mention Sharon, who you heard from throughout the day, who's really been instrumental in helping set this up, our Chief Operating Officer, Michael, our members of our Cyber Cooperation Initiative, Bruce, Andreas, Michael are here, Terry Chapman, who's here, Shayak, Sadiq, and Amar. So all of them are here. Please, I hope you all get to meet them. You can learn a lot more about what we're doing, both who we are, some of our initiatives, some of our activities. Feel free to take this with you, and also to take some of our recent publications. it occurs to me every once in a while that something we've published months ago is very timely. I was just thinking about something one of my colleagues had written on content moderation a little while ago, which in the light of yesterday's announcement about Twitter is about as timely as ever. So do avail yourself of that. Finally, I do want to give a thanks to all of you for spending the day with us, especially on a rainy day like this. One important announcement, we're actually concluding today with drinks downstairs in the ground floor, so please all of you join us if you can for drinks. It's in the Hive. If you come out of the elevator in the lobby, take a left, and hopefully that's how we'll end our day today. Thanks again, and welcome to what has been the first Rise in a Dialogue DC in person. Thanks again. Bye.